Between the 1920s and 1960s, silver screen icons captivated millions with charm and talent. But behind studio gates and dazzling premieres, many of these stars were hiding private battles with mental illness. Childhood traumas, crushing studio pressures, and substance abuse lurked in the shadows of their fame, shaping lives marked by brilliance and pain. In this exposé, we journey actor by actor into the secret heartbreaks of 20 Hollywood legends. Judy Garland, a way of life in pills and heartache. Judy Garland's rainbow was tarnished by the time she was a teenager. Born Frances Gumm in 1922, she had been pushed onto the vaudeville stage by an overbearing mother who became, in Garland's words, the real Wicked Witch of the West. At just 9 years old, Judy's mother began giving her pep pills and sleeping pills to meet the grueling demands of show business. Under contract at MGM as a teen, Judy was treated less like a cherished star and more like a product. Studio boss Louis B. Mayer bullied her about her weight, calling her a fat little pig with pigtails, and enforced near-starvation diets of chicken soup, black coffee, and cigarettes. They had us working days and nights on end. Garland later recalled of the frenetic film shoots with co-star Mickey Rooney. They'd give us pills to keep us on our feet long after we were exhausted. Then they'd knock us out with sleeping pills. Mickey sprawled out on one bed and me on another. Off-screen, the vivacious girl who sang Over the Rainbow was spiraling. By her mid-20s, after years of studio-mandated drug use and emotional abuse, Garland suffered a complete nervous breakdown. In 1947, she was committed to a sanitarium and, following an attempt, endured electroconvulsive therapy for severe depression. The public knew little of this at the time, only that MGM dropped their brightest musical star. Garland later admitted she had become a walking advertisement for sleeping pills, acknowledging that even prescription drugs can be a tremendous strain on the nervous system. Despite multiple comebacks, triumphant concerts, and a landmark 1954 film, A Star is Born, her demons never loosened their grip. At times, I have been pretty much of a walking advertisement for sleeping pills, she said ruefully in her later years, aware that the very medicine meant to calm her was destroying her. By 1969, the beloved Judy Garland was gone at 47. Marilyn Monroe, fragile candle in the wind. To the public, Marilyn Monroe was the ultimate bombshell, pure radiance and flirtation. But Norma Jean Mortenson's meteoric rise from a troubled childhood, the belied profound psychological anguish. Born in 1926 to a single mother who was in and out of mental hospitals, young Norma Jean endured foster homes and an orphanage, never knowing the stability of a real family. As an adult, she reinvented herself as Marilyn Monroe, yet the wounds of abandonment and genetic predisposition to mental illness ran deep. We knew that she was manic depressive, which is now called bipolar, revealed Dr. Hyman Engelberg, Marilyn's physician. Indeed, beneath her dazzling smile, Marilyn was plagued by extreme mood swings, crippling anxiety, chronic insomnia, and even possible psychotic symptoms. According to biographer Lois Banner, the star struggled with a severe stutter and dyslexia, and she might have been hearing voices as well. Over the years, Marilyn attempted to end multiple times before that final tragic night in 1962. Despite her fragility, Monroe fought desperately for her sanity. By 1960, the pressures of fame and failed love affairs had nearly broken her. By the end of 1960, Marilyn Monroe was coming apart, one account observed. After a particularly harrowing bout of suicidal despair in early 1961, Marilyn voluntarily entered the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic, only to find the experience terrifying. She felt less like a patient than a prisoner. There was no empathy at Payne Whitney. It had a very bad effect. I felt I was in some kind of prison for a crime I hadn't committed, Marilyn wrote in a desperate letter from the ward. Locked in a padded cell, hearing the screams of other patients, she smashed a chair against a window in panic, cutting her hand just to get the staff's attention. "If you are going to treat me like a nut, I'll act like a nut," she warned, utterly traumatized by the ordeal. A friend intervened to have her transferred to a private hospital, but the damage was done. The experience left her even more shaken. In a rare press acknowledgement, Time magazine noted Marilyn's nervous breakdown, unwittingly praising her for shedding light on mental illness, even though she had no such desire to be a poster child. In her final months, Monroe saw a psychiatrist 5 times a week, trying to slay the dragons of despair that stalked her. She juggled amphetamines for energy and champagne to numb the pain. The world saw only the glamorous image, the flowing white dress over a subway grate, the sultry rendition of Happy Birthday to the President, while the real Marilyn privately lamented, "I wasn't psychologically meant to be a picture star." She felt, as one close observer put it, "Not a person, I was a commodity. I had to get out." But escape eluded her. On August 5, 1962, at just 36, Marilyn's candle in the wind was extinguished. Vivien Leigh, the two faces of Scarlett. Vivien Leigh's beauty and poise as Scarlett O'Hara masked a mind at war with itself. The English Rose, who won 2 Oscars, suffered from manic depressive psychosis, what we now know as bipolar disorder, at a time when the illness was deeply misunderstood. Even at school, she would withdraw and occasionally be almost hysterical, observed a childhood classmate of Vivien's, noting drastic mood swings in the young girl. These early hints of instability were overlooked amid Vivien's ascent to stardom, but the pressures of fame and devastating personal losses soon triggered full-blown episodes of mental illness. By the late 1940s, while married to actor Laurence Olivier, Vivien's euphoric highs and violent lows had become impossible to ignore. In 1945, she suffered a miscarriage that left her distraught. Shortly after, on the set of Caesar and Cleopatra, she experienced a very bad outburst, which she had no memory of. She just went haywire for about half an hour and nobody could control her, according to biographer Alan Strachan. Strachan believes this breakdown was born out of bottled disappointment and very deep sadness over losing the baby. Vivien's most infamous collapse came in 1953 while filming Elephant Walk in Hollywood. She slipped into her worst manic state to date, becoming incoherent and delusional. On set, Leigh began randomly reciting lines from her past roles, at times becoming Blanche Dubois, her mentally unstable character from Streetcar, in the middle of entirely different scenes. She couldn't remember her new lines. Her co-workers saw that she was clearly very disturbed. Ultimately, Vivien had to be replaced by Elizabeth Taylor on that film. The aftermath was harrowing. Vivien was flown back to England and admitted to a mental hospital for 3 months, then another extended stay at a second clinic. There, she underwent the era's brutal remedy, electroconvulsive therapy. Olivier later described coming home to a wife he barely recognized. "Not now the Vivien I had known." The shocks had temporarily subdued her mania, but at a cruel cost. "It must have been absolutely horrific for her," Strachan noted of Vivien's ECT treatment. In quieter moments, Vivien Leigh had startling insight into her condition. "When I get totally depressed and I'm really run down, I'm like a thing, an amoeba, at the bottom of the sea," she confided to a reporter in 1960. "I stop everything then, and only my friends can pull me up." During manic phases, by contrast, she became hypersexual and reckless, straining her marriage with affairs and public scenes. Olivier himself was at a loss. Years later, he wrote that Vivien's illness meant a cyclical to and fro between the depths of depression and wild, uncontrollable mania. Montgomery Clift, The Longest Ending. Montgomery Clift's matinee idol, looks and sensitive performances made him a pioneer of method acting, but also the protagonist of what one friend grimly called the longest killing in Hollywood history. Clift soared to fame in the late 1940s as a brooding yet beautiful leading man, but privately he was a tangle of insecurity, chronic pain, and hidden shame. A devastating car crash in 1956 shattered Clift's face and spirit. Elizabeth Taylor, a dear friend, rushed to the crash site and literally saved him from choking to death on his teeth. The physical injuries healed, but Monty was never the same. His face wasn't truly disfigured, it was much older. A writer noted of Clift's post-accident appearance, the once dazzling young actor now looked like he'd aged 10 years in a flash. Racked with pain from broken bones that never set properly, Clift found refuge in pills in the bottle. He had started drinking heavily even before the crash. Christopher Isherwood's diary in 1955 laments Monty drinking himself out of a career. But afterward, substance abuse became Clift's constant companion. On film sets, the decline was painfully evident. By the late 1950s, crew members on Raintree County used code words to signal Clift's level of inebriation. Georgia meant he was drunk, Florida, very drunk, and Zanzibar, the worst of all. The handsome young man who had once been the embodiment of artistic control could now barely get through a scene without slurring or forgetting lines. Directors tried to fire him, but loyal friends like Elizabeth Taylor and Katharine Hepburn shielded Clift when they could. Still, no protection could save Clift from himself. On the set of The Misfits, Marilyn Monroe, who was fighting her own losing battle with addiction, observed Monty and sadly remarked he was the only person I know who is in even worse shape than I am. Frances Farmer, broken by insanity, branded by myth. The saga of Frances Farmer stands as one of Hollywood's most harrowing cautionary tales. In the 1930s, Farmer was a rising star, a willful, intelligent actress whose edgy reputation set her apart. But Frances's defiant spirit collided head-on with 1940s psychiatry, and the impact was devastating. Prone to mood swings and heavy drinking, Farmer increasingly clashed with studio executives and the press. In 1942, after a string of public incidents, her unraveling accelerated. She divorced hastily, fought with directors, and was arrested for drunk driving. The breaking point came one January morning in 1943, during a court hearing for probation violation. Unkempt and exhausted, 29-year-old Frances stood before a judge and snapped. When asked if she'd been drinking, she shot back, "Yes, I drank everything I could get, including Benzedrine." And when pressed about a bar fight the night before, she cried out, "Have you ever had a broken heart?" before lunging at policemen in a hysterical fit. Her anguished wail in that courtroom, "Have you ever had a broken heart?" was the sound of a woman at her mental brink. Farmer was promptly institutionalized, marking the start of 7 dark years in and out of asylums. Doctors of the era could not agree on her diagnosis. Some labeled her manic depressive psychosis, others claimed schizophrenia with paranoid illusions, or simply split personality. What is certain is the treatments she endured were nightmarish. At Los Angeles General Hospital's psychiatric ward, she was subjected to insulin shock therapy, massive insulin injections that induced daily comas and convulsions, an experimental treatment believed to jolt patients back to sanity, a brutal physical attack which not only stunned the brain cells, but shocked the body as well and left the patient racked with nausea and pain, was how Frances later described those insulin shock sessions. Her pleas to stop were ignored until her mother intervened to secure a release. But back home in Seattle, Frances remained volatile. In 1944, after a vicious argument, her mother had her declared legally insane in a court hearing. 2 psychiatrists testified that Frances showed agitation, delusions, and paranoia, and needed indefinite commitment. Frances Farmer, not yet 31, was ordered to Western State Hospital, a bleak, overcrowded asylum where the worst chapter of her story unfolded. Jean Tierney, beauty chained in a prison of the mind. Jean Tierney's luminous presence lit up 1940s classics like Laura, but her brightest role concealed a life shadowed by severe mental illness. By her mid-20s, Tierney had achieved fame and married Oleg Cassini, a dashing designer. Yet a tragic twist of fate in 1943 triggered Jean's descent into depression. While pregnant with her first child, Jean contracted rubella, reportedly from a fan who broke a quarantine to meet her. The daughter that Jean delivered, Daria, was born deaf and developmentally disabled. The guilt and grief overwhelmed Tierney. Doctors advised institutionalizing the child, and though Jean reluctantly agreed for Daria's care, she never recovered from the loss, notes one account. It marked the beginning of her battle with depression, hallucinations, and delusional thinking. For years, Tierney fought her inner demons in silence, even as she continued acting. On the set of The Left Hand of God with Humphrey Bogart, she was virtually incapacitated once the camera stopped. Friends recall Jean sobbing uncontrollably, convinced people were poisoning her. Her star persona, elegant, cool, and control, had fractured. Finally, after terrifying hallucinations and an urge to leap from a hotel balcony, Jean sought help. At the urging of her brother, Jean entered a sanitarium in New York City. And there, to my eternal regret, she says, I received my first electric shock therapy, Tierney recounted. Doctors administered electroshock treatments 27 times in total. It was the most degrading time of my life, Jean confessed. I felt like a lab rat. Strapped down in restraints, she fantasized that a kind intern might fall in love with her and set her free. Relief from the ECT was brief. Her depressive symptoms would lift for a few weeks, only to return with agonizing relapses, she said. Desperate, Tierney attempted killing in 1957, nearly flinging herself off a 14-story ledge before being talked down by police. Jean Tierney spent much of the late 1950s in and out of institutions. I existed in a world that never is, the prison of the mind, she later wrote of those lost years. Yet Tierney's story took a hopeful turn. With the advent of better medications and a supportive new marriage to Texas oilman Howard Lee, Jean found stability by the 1960s. Invariably, her hallucinations disappear as suddenly as they begin. Observed a People magazine profile. After episodes, Jean could even joke with her husband about them. I'll turn to Howard and say, Howard, have I been sick? And he'll say, oh boy, have you ever? And we'll laugh about it. Dorothy Dandridge, the songbird caged by depression. Dorothy Dandridge was a trailblazer, the first Black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar. But behind her historic success lay profound personal anguish. Groomed as a performer from childhood, Dandridge endured trauma early on. She and her sister Vivian were managed by a volatile, abusive woman who was rumored to beat and even sexually abuse them during their vaudeville years. These wounds of youth left Dorothy with severe nervous disorders and deep insecurities. In the 1950s, after rising to fame in Carmen Jones, Dorothy appeared to have it all: beauty, talent, acclaim. Yet her personal life was crumbling. She suffered repeated failures in love, including a turbulent marriage to dancer Harold Nicholas that produced her beloved but severely brain-damaged daughter, Carolyn. Caring for a special needs child largely alone took a heavy emotional toll. By the early 60s, Dandridge's once promising film opportunities had dried up due to the entrenched racism of Hollywood. As one peer observed, Dorothy was the right person in the right place at the wrong time. Opportunities for a Black leading lady were heartbreakingly limited. Facing financial ruin after a second failed marriage, Dandridge spiraled into despair. In 1963, utterly bankrupt, she could no longer afford Carolyn's 24-hour medical care and had to institutionalize her little girl. That was the final blow. Dandridge soon suffered a nervous breakdown, one biography notes bluntly. She took to drinking heavily and popping antidepressants to blunt her guilt and pain. Friends noticed the once vivacious entertainer now appeared distant and deeply sad. Feeling depressed and desperate, Dorothy felt unfulfilled as a mother and a wife, wrote one analyst, summarizing her plight. On stage, she sometimes fell physically ill from anxiety, the weight of her worries manifesting as fainting spells and stomach pains. By September 1965, Dorothy Dandridge's bright flame had dimmed to a flicker. Just 42 years old, she was found dead in her West Hollywood apartment from an overdose of tofranil, an antidepressant. Whether it was a self-ending or an accidental overdose remains a topic of debate. No ending note was definitively proven to exist, or it may have been suppressed. But a haunting clue lies in something Dorothy reportedly confided. She had a premonition she wouldn't live past her early 40s. Sadly, she was right. Clara Bow, the It Girl's shattered nerves. In the roaring 1920s, Clara Bow personified joie de vivre as Hollywood's original It Girl, a vivacious flapper who seemed the embodiment of carefree youth. But Clara's laughter hid unspeakable childhood horrors and a genetic predisposition to instability. Raised in Brooklyn slums, Bow survived poverty, an alcoholic father, and a mother who suffered psychosis, and once tried to kill young Clara with a butcher knife, rather than see her pursue acting. These traumas left deep scars. Though Clara rocketed to fame in silent films with her magnetic charm, her mental health steadily declined as Hollywood both idolized and exploited her. By 1930, with the advent of talkies, Clara was under tremendous stress. She had a crippling fear that her Brooklyn accent and wild child reputation would derail her career in the new sound era. Gossip columns hounded her with scandalous stories about her love life and partying. The once lively star became increasingly anxious, paranoid, and erratic. In 1931, at just 25, Clara Bow suffered a very public mental breakdown. She abruptly quit her latest film and was admitted to a sanatorium, reportedly in a state of hysterical exhaustion. Doctors described her condition vaguely as shattered nerves, a catch-all for severe mental distress. Clara was experiencing symptoms we would recognize as classic to schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Wild mood swings, paranoia that people were out to harm her, and auditory hallucinations. Bow's battle with mental illness included both depression and schizophrenia. One retrospective notes bluntly, she experienced severe mood swings and periods of intense emotional distress. The studio system had no patience for such hysterics. Paramount dropped her, and Clara, then one of the highest-paid stars in the world, retired from acting in 1933 at only 28. She married cowboy actor Rex Bell and fled Hollywood for a ranch in Nevada, seeking refuge from the spotlight that had become so punishing. Sadly, Clara's demons followed her into seclusion. In 1944, a decade after leaving films, she attempted killing during a particularly dark, depressive episode. A few years later, Clara Bow was diagnosed with serious schizophrenia during a psychiatric evaluation. She was said to suffer delusions and would sometimes become catatonic. Doctors prescribed shock treatments in the late 1940s, the standard but brutal course for schizophrenia at the time. Clara's two sons later recounted that their mother often sat alone in a dark room, smoking cigarettes, her once sparkling eyes now vacant. The vivacious it girl, who had danced and flirted on screen, now fought simply to get through each day without succumbing to terrifying hallucinations or crushing despair. On September 27, 1965, Clara Bow died of a heart attack at age 60. Barbara Payton, Descent into Darkness. Barbara Payton's life reads like a film noir cautionary tale. A blonde starlet who tasted quick fame in the early 1950s, only to plunge into a nightmare of addiction, violence, and mental ruin. Payton was once hailed as a poor man's Lana Turner, earning $10,000 a week and starring opposite Gary Cooper and James Cagney. But Barbara's off-screen exploits soon eclipsed her work. She gained notorious headlines for a scandalous love triangle involving two actors, Franchot Tone and Tom Neal, that erupted in a brutal brawl, leaving Tone in a coma. The tabloids labeled her a femme fatale, blaming her for the incident. Studios began to shun her, and Barbara's already chaotic personal life spiraled further. Alcohol and drugs became her coping mechanisms. By her late 20s, her career was effectively over, and her marriages had all disintegrated. As one biographer put it, everything that could go wrong in a life seems to have happened to Payton. All-night bacchanals of drugs and alcohol, a stabbing, beatings, mobsters, blackmail attempts, and severe mental illness. In a short order, Barbara Payton went from Hollywood parties at Romanoff's to soliciting strangers on Sunset Boulevard. By 1960, Payton was living on the streets of Hollywood, literally selling her body to survive. Out-of-control alcoholism ruined her beauty and finances, and by 1960, she was destitute and forced to survive as a prostitute, writes film historian John O'Dowd, who chronicled her downfall. Payton's self-destructive streak was well known. She herself admitted freely to her new profession. "I'm a whore, and by God, the men are going to pay dearly for me," she declared, with a mix of defiance and despair. In that crude statement is the voice of a woman who had been used by so many men in Hollywood and beyond, now trying to reclaim power in the only way she felt she had left. But in truth, Barbara was deeply unwell. Friends from her glory days were horrified at the fat, disheveled figure who appeared in court on vice charges or at seedy bars in a stupor. Her once radiant face bore the bloated marks of end-stage alcoholism. She suffered hallucinations during withdrawal and bouts of psychosis when heavily intoxicated, at times claiming people were out to kill her. The press mostly snickered at her misfortune, dubbing her box office poison and worse, yet a few sensed her tragic dimension. By the mid-1960s, Barbara had returned to live with her parents in San Diego, effectively in their care as her organs began failing. She attempted to write an autobiography titled I Am Not Ashamed, laying bare her sins and struggles. It was an oddly raw, unpolished account in which Barbara refused to paint herself as a victim. She owned her choices, however destructive, with brutal candor. But even this catharsis could not save her. Years of hard living had done their damage physically and mentally. On May 8, 1967, Barbara Payton died on her parents' couch from heart and liver failure. She was 39. Veronica Lake, drowning in the bottle. With her peekaboo blonde hair and sultry allure, Veronica Lake was a 1940s icon. Yet her fame was brief, and her fall from grace steep. Behind Veronica's cool facade lay lifelong mental health struggles. As a child, Lake had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, according to her mother. She was a troubled, rebellious girl sent into acting as a form of therapy. Astonishingly, she managed to keep her condition in check through her early Hollywood years. But the stress of stardom and a tumultuous personal life unraveled her stability. Lake's meteoric career faltered by her late 20s amid stories of difficult on-set behavior and a reputation for being hard to handle. Some of this was studio spin. Veronica bristled at being controlled, and she got tired of people expecting her to fit into a box, explained film historian Eddie Muller. But some was her illness surfacing. She self-medicated heavily with alcohol. She was behaving the way a lot of men did, and they got a pass, Muller notes. But Lake, as a woman, was instead labeled as troubled. By the early 1950s, Lake's mental illness plunged her into bouts of severe depression and paranoia, one newspaper later recounted. She endured hallucinations and erratic mood swings as her untreated schizophrenia grew worse, compounded by relentless drinking. At one point, she confessed to friends that she believed strangers were conspiring against her. The offers of film roles dried up. In 1952, after multiple divorces and bankruptcy, Veronica famously was discovered working as a cocktail waitress at the cheap Martha Washington Hotel in New York. The public was astonished that the once glamorous star had sunk so low. A journalist who met her then wrote that at just 34, Veronica appeared to be in her 70s, a disheveled, rail-thin woman with haunted eyes. Yet Lake herself still possessed self-awareness and mordant wit. I had to get out of Hollywood, she later wrote in her autobiography. I was never psychologically meant to be a picture star. She hated the factory-like treatment of actors and felt her psyche simply wasn't built for it. I wasn't a person, I was a commodity, she told one interviewer, describing how the studio system suffocated her individuality. In 1966, Veronica Lake attempted a modest comeback, but her health was failing. She remained plagued by alcoholism, which she used to blunt the voices and anxieties that tormented her, and by poverty. Still, a spark of dignity persisted. In a TV interview near the end of her life, Lake spoke candidly about her struggles, admitting, "I did suffer from mental illness. I didn't know it at the time. At times I was focused. Other times the wheels would come off." She tried to caution young actors about the importance of mental health. Tragically, Veronica did not live to see the world fully appreciate her honesty. In 1973, at age 50, she died of acute hepatitis, essentially alone and forgotten. Margaret Sullivan, The Tides of Melancholy. On screen, Margaret Sullivan projected a feisty, spirited charm in 1930s films like The Shop Around the Corner. Off-screen, she fought recurring depressive episodes that she described as going from high spirits to collapse. Sullivan's colleagues knew her as mercurial. Director Frank Borzage famously said, "Margaret goes up and down like a yo-yo, and no one can figure out why." In truth, Sullivan likely suffered from undiagnosed bipolar depression. "It's my nature to go around in high spirits most of the time," and then to collapse, she admitted to her daughter Brooke Hayward, who quoted Margaret on page 215 of her memoir Haywire. That cycle, exuberance followed by breakdown, defined Sullivan's life. She endured terrible lows, often triggered by events in her turbulent personal life. A mother of three, Sullivan agonized over her children's struggles. She divorced and married multiple times, including a stormy union with agent-turned-producer Leland Hayward. By the 1950s, Sullivan's hearing began to fail due to a congenital condition. This hearing loss dealt a crushing blow to her stage career and deepened her isolation, an added layer to her depression. Friends noted that Margaret's final years were marked by an air of sadness. The collapse of her family weighed on her. Her eldest daughter, Bridget, had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and her son, Bill, with a mood disorder. Sullivan felt helpless as she watched her children's mental health crumble. By 1959, her own depression had become severe. She made what would be her last stage appearance that year, repeatedly breaking down in tears backstage. On New Year's Day 1960, at age 50, Margaret Sullivan was found dead in a Connecticut hotel. No note was found, and her death was officially ruled an accident. But those close to her suspected killing. Margaret had been emotionally fragile and in treatment, but ultimately the high spirits gave way to an irreversible collapse. As her daughter Brooke later wrote, "The mental breakdown of my mother and sister cast a long shadow over their family." Peg Antwistle, lost in the Hollywood Hills. Peg Antwistle's name is less known today, but her death gave Hollywood one of its most haunting legends. In September 1932, the 24-year-old aspiring actress climbed a maintenance ladder to the top of the giant H in the Hollywoodland sign and jumped into the darkness. The next day, a hiker found Peg's shattered body in the ravine below, along with a small purse containing a note. Its contents were heartbreaking in their brevity. "I am afraid I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain." P.E. Those words, poignant, apologetic, despairing, offered a stark glimpse into Peg Antwistle's mindset after a string of disappointments. Peg's short life had been marked by tragedy and dashed hopes. Born in Wales and raised in New York, she lost both parents early. Orphaned by her teens, Peg nevertheless showed great promise on Broadway, even inspiring a young Bette Davis who saw her perform and declared she wanted to be exactly like Peg Antwistle. But the stock market crash and Great Depression dried up theatrical work. In 1932, Peg moved to Hollywood to try her luck in films. She landed a small role in an RKO thriller, 13 Women, but when the movie released, most of her performance had been cut. Not only that, critics panned the film. Shortly thereafter, RKO canceled Peg's contract. She was penniless, unemployed, and recently divorced from a brief, unhappy marriage. In a city brimming with glamour and success, Peg Antwistle felt herself a failure after only a few months. On the night of September 16, 1932, Peg told her uncle that she was going for a walk to meet some friends. Instead, she hiked up the rugged path to the famous sign that symbolized the dreams of movie makers. In a sadly ironic twist, a letter arrived at Peg's residence 2 days after her death, offering her a part in a play.